Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are on the chapter Service of the Design Way. So today we are going to start off with Joe. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark. We would love to hear what you got from the chapter. It's a very core concept. It's really one of the most wonderful concepts in this book. So I hope, many people volunteer to talk about what they got from this chapter. So let's start with Joe. Joe, what did you get?
So, there are a lot of things to take away from this chapter, as you mentioned, and it is one of the core ones to the book. I think that it really kind of complements and highlights the importance of the desiderata, specifically the client and designer relationship, and how those values actually need to be aligned in order to have, form a very good intention. I think that the most important thing for me to take away from the book was to notice the specific types of designs that exist, for what reason. If they exist for the sense of just material or personal power or things along those lines, if you really consider that in a design, that you start to really wonder about the intention of how the role it plays in your life. And that's in anything you look at. And I think this is especially relevant today when we look at technology and the way technology is actually designed to addict us to a product versus actually to have a healthy relationship with it. So if we start to take a step back and really look at the intentions of the design, then we start to be able to understand how the products are going to impact us on a personal level. So I think for me, that's the most the most important part that I had taken away from this. There's also this idea of designing and the importance of communication in this process, specifically between the client, where you're taking the implicit and explicit in order to coming up with a design product that is actually for an ideal. It talked a little bit about how to, the importance of rhetoric, but maybe not having to use rhetoric, but this whole idea of just bringing the intention out of the client overall. There's also let me see, I have some other notes that I would just like to talk about. Actually, for now, I'm going to leave it there. That's really just high level, but
sounds good.
Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Sounds good. You can come back at any point. Next up is going to be Evanique.
I wanted to focus on the part that really got to me was the difference between service and servitude and helping. And it helped me look at service in a different way, that service is a relationship between equals. And I thought that was a very important distinction, because it says that serving is different from helping. Helping is based on inequality. It is not a relationship between equals. Service is a relationship between equals. Helping incurs debt. When you help someone, they owe you one. But serving, like healing, is mutual. There is no debt. And I think that is a very important distinction in being a designer, is that when you're in service to a client or you're in service to someone that you're helping, you got to see them as an equal and not as you're helping them with something. You're trying to serve them in achieving their goal. Whereas helping does have a connotation of being unequal. And it's like, and I always think of that, and then further in the chapter, it talks about philanthropy and how philanthropists sometimes try to help people, and really they should be serving people, because if you're trying to help someone and you're not listening to them, you're not really helping them. You're not helping them achieve their desiderata or their desired goal. And it's not because you know better than them, it's because you just haven't really listened to them. And it's almost like when you're helping them, you're thinking you're going in, like it feels like you're going in as someone who's above that person. And it doesn't achieve a goal, and it doesn't achieve the design. and it doesn't go along with what we've been studying and reading in the book about serving a client. So I just thought that was like a wonderful distinction that I never thought about before.
Excellent. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Mike. Maritza.
The part of this chapter that spoke to me most was speaking of the design protocol roles, and that there's a figure on figure 2.4 here, talking about service. But very briefly, it's mentioned that the I thou comes from Martin Buber and Eric, let me see if I know how to say the name, Janst, or Janst. I'm probably killing it. But the interesting thing to me is that my familiarity with the I thou and I it relationships is from reading about different, it's the cognitive behavior therapy. It comes up occasionally. So I was interested in that. So I kind of looked a little more, and there's this, there's a PDF here that I'm looking at, that I'm basing most of what I'm going to say today on. It's called Coming of Age in the Heart. And it's a look into the relationship, this relationship that we have with others and with ourselves. And so bear with me a little bit. I'm reading some direct passages here, but I think it's strongly related. It just gives you a deeper view into what is meant when we say I, it, I, other, I, us, I, them, and the segregating facets of them. Like, and it's twofold. First, it's like how you say it frames where your movement is going, right? Like it's kind of one of those, we get in these roles, but the words, the very words themselves allow you to frame the direction. So this says, as expressed in by the late systems theorist, Eric Janst, the I-it relationship is a product of rational thinking, as in documenting the scientific details of an ecosystem or a population. By contrast, the I-thou relationship is mythic, emerging not from details, but from the essence. When we experience the world around us as thou, we touch its numinous quality. Then we can love something for its own sake, rather than for purely selfish interest. This kind of love seeks to preserve rather than to exploit. From the I-thou perspective, we see our world as a living entity, and this mythos gives us a new meaning and purpose. Only then we can grow into the co-creative evolution of the collective we. I think that is where we're going here. Basically, what this entire chapter is telling you is that your design will fail if you never look outside yourself. And that's really pretty much this chapter in a nutshell. I'm actually absolutely shocked that Joe did not bring up the concept of empathy. I was so sure you would. Since he didn't, I'm gonna jump in here and put a little bit in there. We're talking about how, we can grow into this co-creative evolution of the collective we. And so so this says we need to integrate the values of psyche and of society that have created division rather than unification. This integration occurs through the realm of relationship, for the act of relating creates compassion and awakens the heart. Again, in this chapter, that's the gist of what it's saying. We need to find a way to get into the act of relating. And this says, we are less likely to harm something to which we relate, just as we are not likely to eat the family cat, even though otherwise we eat meat from the market. As we learn about other cultures, other environments, other ways of being, awareness begets relationship and offsets harm. can see how this is applicable to a design process. If one is considering the others involved in the design process, and if one is seeking truly to act in service of the involved parties, one is less likely to do harm to the end product. That's what I'm seeing there. And this is where we get to empathy, because in order to make this learning and make these steps, this requires compassion and empathy. And these are, essential aspects. So empathy develops when we acknowledge our wounds, our shadow, and reclaim the feeling function that allows us to feel with another. Feel with, again, it's that I, thou, or the I, them. You're getting outside of yourself in order to reach some kind of understanding that is bigger than the very myopic vision that we could possibly have if we're only looking at ourselves. So I am going to end there, because I really just wanted to focus on the I, thou. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And Maritza, I'm shocked that you didn't bring up the I and community together, because I think that is the core of the chapter.
So that's actually this whole thing. I was thinking, I'm trying not to sound like a broken record. I beat people up enough with the concepts of community. And I did a little bit, when I mentioned that we become the we, we integrate the values of psyche and of society that have created division rather than unification. And that's a little bit community.
No, it's wonderful that we know, having done all these meetups together, what you would expect Joe to say, what you would expect Maritza to say. Wonderful. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Charlie. Mike.
Yeah, I was happy to read on page 45 how the authors have talked about architecture being kind of the midpoint between art and science. And I found here particularly that I'm able to talk to architects, engineers, and artists here in this very meetup and talk about that interaction between the three, like an architect being the bridge between those two realms. And I found it also connected to the Tao Te Ching meetups that we do, because you turn 2 pages later and the 5 design factors they have, the 5th one is the only one that melds the other 4. It kind of shows there's uniformity, but it's fluid, right? It's not it is the circular kind of idea that is flowing in between. So as a breakout room discussion, that's the kind of thing I would like to kick around, but I get an opportunity to do it here with a real architect, et cetera. And I'm always interested, for example, in aeronautics. I love the design of flight of airplanes. I'm not a pilot and I don't know anything about design, but I think that's a perfect example of the interaction between art and science. You want the plane to be beautiful. You want it to look nice in the air, look nice at takeoff, but the darn thing has to fly. So you have that interplay between who's ever designing the plane and the man or woman who has to fly the darn thing. And I think it's fascinating how that works. And I'd always be curious to hear about what goes on behind the scenes as those planes are being designed, or a building, right? It has the same aesthetic versus practical value. So 52 Living Ideas gives us a chance to actually hear from the architects and the designers. Then flipping on when they were talking about contracts between people, where some are implied and then you have real legal documents. I'm kind of a goofy guy. I've never written a resume in my life. So I've somehow floated from point A to wherever I am in the alphabet without formally writing a resume. So everything's been a handshake or an implied contract. And I was happy to hear that the authors talked about the importance of that, like goodwill is kind of implied by that. You can have a written contract with someone, but if your fiduciary responsibility is not implied by your word or by your handshake, I think it's all pretty much meaningless. So I was very happy to read that later on. But going forward, and I'll conclude with this, I would love to hear specifically from the artists and the engineers and the architects here what they think about the interplay between those three spheres.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is going to be Charlie, followed by Becky. Charlie.
Yeah. Okay. When I was reading this, one of the places where I got pretty stuck was this idea of the 5 classifications of relationship between the client and the designer. And one comment in particular that I took offense to was the idea of that the person who is helping somebody is the thing I ebook. Okay, you can download it for free. It's biology.
Charlie, you're breaking up.
Okay, how about now? I just went a little bit too far away from my mic, probably. How now?
Let's try it. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so that I'm looking at things from the point of view of process philosophy, and and one of the things that I just thought of just before this meetup is I looked up the process philosophy and design philosophy, and it's I'm just gonna copy and paste in the chat my results. Basically, there doesn't seem to be a lot of overlap. What was it with design philosophy? There's 113,000 hits. Process philosophy, 21,000 hits, and if you put them both together, you only get 92 hits. And so this concept of trying to put these things together, okay, I think is really important, because if you think in terms of objects and properties, okay, in a very capitalist point of view, and you got winners and losers and takers and makers and all that other crap, okay, then it makes sense to look at, that somehow you're giving something to somebody that they don't really deserve it or something like that. You're feeling pity for them or something. But if you cut yourself, okay, is the process that heals the wound, is it acting out of pity? No. Is part of a larger system, is part of a process. And the whole process works together in a holistic sense. It's a gestalt. And so the way of looking at, for me, the way of looking at design that makes the most sense to me is to think of it as being part of that process, so that if you go against the process, if you get this kind of egomaniacal idea that you're some kind of Ubermensch or something, that you're going to dominate the world and you're going to make things the way you want them to be and all that stuff. No, you're completely, you've lost it. Okay. And another thing, that was brought up was this I-thou relationship, which I take very seriously. And people may not know this, but the book that was written by Martin Buber was about his relationship with God. And there's a nice quote by a guy named Louis Lavelle that that love is pure attention to the existence of the other. So that love is like forming a relationship, rather than thinking in terms of objects and properties, to rather think of reality in terms of relationships. And that love is a deepening, an ever deepening of relationship, a greater and greater attention. A mother knows this with their child. They know every little detail of their hands and their hair, everything. Okay. And so that if you have a relationship like that, if you in fact take that as a fundamental existent love, that is a basis for how you behave and act, that it makes more sense, okay, in terms of process philosophy, is love as being like consciousness as a fundamental existent, rather than something that you give to somebody, like you give people money, but love isn't something you give, it's something that you make possible through your actions. And so, I just kind of wanted to bring that out, because I think it was important. And it's really too bad that so few people are making that connection between design philosophy and process philosophy.
Thank you, Charlie. Next up is going to be Becky, followed by Laura. And then we'll go to Jing.
I actually have very similar thoughts, at least opinion to what Charlie had just expressed. So I also took up a bit of an issue with how helping was described. And though I did agree with like the idea of like that mutual relationship, it's like ideally you would want that kind of collaboration so that you receive that 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 expected unexpected of knowing what you had wanted and assuming that you're also the customer and the consumer as well as the client, that through some unexpected method or way it was given to you, and that's great. But in that hierarchical relationship where it's one way, it's sometimes I think usually actually in the book, it's like nonprofits, governmental agencies, non-government organizations. They're spending millions of dollars on behalf of helpless, sick, unlucky, or tragedy struck. That's one way. They don't really have much of a say of what they get. So they're the ones receiving. They're the customers. They're the consumers. There's not that back and forth going on. So, but then I guess like the idea that it's like, well, a quick fix, like the wording of like, oh, well, you have a quick fix, you're just throwing, you're hurting, you're fueling the problem. I don't really see it so much as that. I see it as not so much of whether or not it's a quick fix that carelessly simplifies the solution, or perhaps a reinforcing. The below paragraph was like a reinforcing or legitimizing or justifying this power differential. I don't see it at all. I really think it's more of enablement versus empowerment. And when you're the client, well, not the client, the consumer or the customer, it's like what ends up happening out of that design, or what is it promoting? That's really what it comes down to. And so when you're looking at it from like a large organization like the government making these policies for a large amount of people, it's harder to have that discernment to say this is going to empower X amount, or this is going to enable X amount. So it seems like it's a blanket, like, it's hard to give the adequate discrimination, or maybe that's not the right word, discernment or wisdom to apply, like this is how it should be to help empower someone. But you can definitely do that on an individual basis. And so the idea that helping is actually hurting it, I completely disagree. Is that should have been the focus. Shrikant, can I share a diagram that I?
Sure, give me just a second.
Okay.
Go ahead.
We have 4 quadrants.
Okay. So let me know if you guys see this. Is it showing?
Yes.
Okay, so I diagrammed this, and so this is really how I see it. It's like, well, you have the benefactor, the maybe it's a collaboration of the client and the designer. You have the beneficiary, and then it comes down to how do you judge whether or not the design was good or not? Well, is it an enablement? Is the receiver still in the continued state of need? And in that case, it was exactly as what the paragraph said. It's like, oh, we're reinforcing that that position that the benefactor is needed by the beneficiary. But then on the other hand, okay, well, that's like social media for the most part, not all the time, but then you have empowerment. If you've created something and that has like significantly helped lives of people, and of course you'll have exceptions when you're talking about groups, maybe like vaccines. It's you're not in that same state. the beneficiary can function without you. And so you can judge if that design has been an improvement because you've made that person better off in a different state. And so when I see like helping, I often think, and this is something that I live by with true conviction for myself, is Tao Te Ching chapter 2. And it says, therefore the master acts without doing anything and teaches without saying anything. Things arise and she lets them come. Things disappear and she lets them go. She has, but doesn't possess, acts, but doesn't expect. And when her work is done, she forgets it. That is why it lasts forever. And so when you design something that's good and you're helping, you remove yourself out of the situation as a benefactor and it keeps going. The beneficiary is better off and the person is not dependent on you. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. Is it okay if I share a small personal story?
Please.
So back when I was in college, I had fallen into really bad financial times, and I had to live off on like the wrong side of the tracks, you would say. And this was up in Buffalo. Like I was on government assistance, and I could barely pay my heating and my electric bill. And I was living in a very rundown place with no insulation, middle of Buffalo. And I'm around a lot of other people, sometimes drug addicts, sometimes just like, poverty stricken. And so, I being really having been immersed in that for 2 years, it's something that you really take to heart. And it's like, I think that though sometimes being a recipient of something, of help, sure, I think that there are cases that are outliers on both ends, right? You have people who are enabled and they continue taking, but then should that perhaps it requires more discernment, as I said before, to tighten up those rules so that you're not penalizing those that you're empowering, and that there's a better way of splitting and segmenting these things. Because honestly, without something like that hierarchical helping, I don't think I would be here. And so, and I wrote down the responses, like, in that mutual relationship. And like I said, that's like great if in the design process, if the client's the same as the customer, you have your expectations spelled out in the contract and you get that expected, unexpected. With the response of enablement, you have dependence and or entitlement, that reinforcement of like victimhood. And what you get is an expectation. There's no gratitude, which is the last part. And that's even better. That's like your complete unexpected, because you don't have a say in it, but all of a sudden you have it, and it could completely change everything. So that's all I wanted to share.
Wonderful. Thank you, Becky. That was incredible. Thank you. Next up is going to be Laura.
That's a really tough thing to follow. Thanks. I was going to come and say, as it is, I feel like I'm a light player in this whole thing. So looking at this particular part and trying to find my place that didn't feel comfortable with is the word client. I've never liked that concept of client and helper. So trying to think of what would work for me, maybe the word kind of something like somebody who provides assistance, working with collaborators.
So Laura, you zoomed in on the right thing. So what we're going to do is that during the breakout rooms, let us discuss what are the alternative words that we can use instead of client and service. And then we can come back and have everybody talk about their take. So we'll take, look at this nomenclature at a, let everybody talk about that.
So that's your segue. Did I come in at the right place or any?
Okay. Anything else from the chapter, Laura?
Like I said, I read all this and it makes me feel like I've been given design planning sort of thing in my DNA. I mean, I just read all this and say, okay, I don't think about these things. It's like somebody said, Adele came out with a new album, completely different than anything she's ever done. And they said, okay, how did it happen? What did it? And they're trying to get deep thoughts out of her. And she finally said, look, when I make an album, all I do is think about the music. And it's like, that's it, And here, I think about the design. I don't think about all these things. It makes me crazy that when you would think about it, you just immerse yourself and do it. You get your hands dirty, you go down on the floor, you scrub it, you do this, you do that. And, that's it. And that's how it grows. And that's all I have to say. And
thank you.
Maybe that was what it was about. Maybe not. I don't know.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So what I would say is that, again, this, you bring up a very interesting point. What happens is that different people have different approaches to design. There are people who are kind of operate intuitively. There are people who kind of operate with their feeling. So it's like, and they approach design. They spend a lot of time on design, and it grows on them. They grow with it in a different way than people who are more analytical about it. So there are these various ways of proceeding along the design. And so, I want to respect that. Next up is going to be Jing. Jing, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually want to respond to Laura. I think the process you described is more like the art expression. As a designer, I can see, most of the time we design, we don't think about it, but it helps you improve your design when you think about it, like contemplate. That's how I think we bring from unconscious to conscious. That's how we progress. Then they back to our unconscious, subconscious, whatever. I think that's how we improve. Actually, I found this book helped me a lot during the study with the group. Maybe because I have the practice already, so this really helped me to understand it better with my practice. Anyway, so let me start with sharing the. Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, so the design way today, we're going the chapter 2, service. Actually, I have to say, this is this chapter I get the most so far. The service actually helped me to understand the design much better than I understand before. They mentioned design as a service that's different from other inquiry and action. It's a dynamic relationship between the people being served, the client, surrogate client, customers, consumers, and users, and the people in service, designer, who serve on behalf of the others. So serving is different from changing or convincing people. Then they compare how it's different from science and art. They mentioned the science is more self-serving. You motivate by your own curiosity and passion for knowledge. Then the result is the knowledge you find can be used in the future for others. That's create value. I have a question mark here because I have a friend who actually in the research area, they have to find funding. So I think in that way, they have to have some kind of service in some way to get the funding. Otherwise, it's very hard to do it just for your own passion. Art, the difference is express their own passion, feeling, understanding, and the critique of the world as self-expression. Then the value they create is by sharing their insight with others. They help others understand the human condition, maybe themselves better. Designer, on the contrary, is not self-serving, but other-serving. So they mentioned that's why designer design for themselves as client is very difficult. This actually helped me understand much better, because I have my own project, my own cause I need to develop design, but somehow I never get to it. Now I understand why, because it's very hard to be the client for myself. That's why I'm kind of subconsciously avoiding it. Then they mentioned that the design is a service relationship. The service relationship is not servant of subservient, and is more the mutual equal relationship. Also, service is not facilitator on behalf of somebody else need. And it's also not exclude of self-expression. I totally agree with that. I think that's the reason we love to be designer, because we help others. At the same time, we can express ourselves. But self-expression mentioned is not dominant in the design relationship, like the science or art. I actually have to say, in this area, I think there is actually tell me how our education have some drawbacks, because I didn't learn this in college. Nobody mentioned emphasize service in the education. Actually, everybody want to be the star architect, which we will mention later. And service is not helping people to create what they already know they want. Service success design process is when those of people experience surprise with their own self-recognition. So it's emerged through the design process that meet or exceed client's original expression, what they want. The desiderata. So designer as a midwife of the client desiderata, and they create some outcome that expected also is something unexpected. So they have to have this double intention. They have to create what the client wants, but at the same time, they have to provide something that's unexpected, that exceed their expectation. They remind me of one of my old boss. He always said, you provide what the client wants, then you give them something extra, then they will surprisingly happy. And the service relationship is distinct and complex. And the focus is on responsibility, accountability, and intention. They mentioned the service relationship is the purpose of design. So I put some picture of all the, I think about the service relationship and design, and also the waiter. I think the service relationship is it's quite interesting, because it's about relationship, how you connect with other people, and you understand what they want, and you provide them better than expected. And the design as professional service, I think, is even harder. It's very personal based. That's why I think design service is very hard to scale. I don't know if everybody knows, there's a lot of company going public, but I think design company is very hard because all they have equipment. If you buy a company, the people left, there's nothing left. So it's very personal based professional service. And the design, they mentioned design done with the client is ideal situation, but design done to the client, which is you have to, the need and desire are discovered through persuasion or experience of change, which is not ideal situation. Then they mentioned about there's intentional change done to people like 911, which opposite of service. Then there's an intentional change, like sick accident happened, which need a grieving process. And when people finding meaning is adaptive experience, is a reactive compared to design, it's very proactive. Basic design is making meaning, causing to happen. The designer need to be very proactive and intentional during the whole process. Because the client usually come to designer, not fully know what they want. Or they have this urge, something need to be expressed, but they are not clear. Then designer actually help them to clarify, surface all these hidden needs. And they mentioned this, usually this process is not easy, because when people have this unconscious something, they have this pricing need, but it's unclear, they usually have this sense of anxiety of the future unpredictability, like we mentioned about order and chaos. Basically, they run from the order to chaos. And this whole process is sometimes it's stressful. So designer is making meaning for the client with empathy and draw out of their desire with open communication and understanding the client's intention, their way, the desiderata. The client hasn't fully understand. I think this process really needs a lot of empathy dimension and also patient. I want to give an example with this. Like this is the project I'm working on right now. And the client come to me and said, oh, I want to add something, this is, and I want to add here. And I usually tell clients, let's not focus on the solution yet. Let's find out what you really need. And then we end up, I suggesting, why don't you add on this side? Because there's a stream on that side, it's hard to add. Then this side is better connected with all the other area. So we end up with this solution, which client is pretty happy. So I think it's very important, not because some clients, they don't have usually the first time they join this design process, they don't understand the design process. So they usually sometimes they come with a solution they think is the right way. Then I tell them, that's not solid on solution. Let's find out what you really need. And let me help you to find the best solution that better than you expected. They mentioned the design outcome don't have to be virtuous because some people may not, their purpose is material wealth, personal power may not be virtuous. Some business may not have virtues. And so the design process approach doesn't guarantee a good design. And the designer and stakeholder, the person, not the approach, actually decide responsible for altruistic and sustainable design. I think the aligned value of the designer and client is very critical for good design. I think it's very important for a designer to pick the right client to work with in order to create the right design. They have to have aligned value and purpose. And through the service relationship, design successful when I expect outcomes serve the right people, right purpose, and right place. And they also mentioned, again, the service is not servitude. Service treat the other as equal. It's an equal partnership. And it's not helping. Helping is a power with a helper based on equality and incur depth. And service relationship, there's no depth. So I use some picture of this to show how in the past there's slave, which is totally unequal relationship. They own then there's a Downton Abbey, which a lot of us watched. So then there's a servant, and they actually have a very good relationship, I see from the movie, but still they have this subordinate relationship. But now we have people serve us, we are much more equal in the current society. And I know Vicky mentioned about the helping. Actually, I totally agree with what the book mentioned, and it's really resonated with me because I came from China and I see the Western culture helping relationship is very popular, nonprofit. Every rich people, their life is nonprofit, have a nonprofit organization. It's a way to avoid tax and do the things they think good for other people. And I think that's great. But at the same time, I do see, because I read the book, they mention the people helping others and people being helped, they actually have more things in common. And like they mentioned, there may be subconscious and happiness, whatever, and by helping others, they create this power. And I use these pictures. The first one, I don't know if you guys see the movie, it's called See Inside. It's one of my favorite movies, Spanish movie, and about this guy who paralyzed because of diving, and he tried to fight right to suicide. And the funny thing is, this woman who's a single mom, she tried to trying to talk him out of suicide, think he's desperate, all this. He actually pretty clear, and he's in power. And she told the woman that you guys trying to help me, actually you guys are really need to be helped. So it's quite interesting. If anybody, I strongly recommend this movie. It's the best foreign movie, and it's amazing how it shows some people, they're running around helping others, Maybe they're the one really look inside. They need to look because they feel the power by helping others. Maybe something inside that need to be helped too. And then there's a Chinese saying, I use the second picture, it mentioned, if you give fish to other people, it's not as good as you teach people how to fishing. So in Chinese ancient history, they already tell people, give people things, it's not good. Teach people how to make things, it's a better way to help people. Because one way you create this dependency, you don't empower people. The other way, you really empower people. I think what the book trying to say is not to help you. They mentioned an urgent situation, like if you're sick, you need to have medicine, but medicine doesn't create health. So in the end, you have to use medicine as an urgent mandate, but you have to find a way to bring people back to health. That's take more effort. I actually talked with some other people about this. I think for some reason, we always looking for the quick fix to make people feel good. You know, everything is happened with a GoFundMe, let's fund, donate. And this whole thing seems to resolve, but they don't see what's happening behind that. You know, what caused the whole thing happen, how we prevent these things happen again. I think because it's like they mentioned earlier, it's a wicked problem. This is more complicated. Nobody wants to look into it. And seems donate money is the easier fix. It's more the tame problem. Anyway, I want to, because I really resonate with this, so I want to say about it. And I use the last picture. This actually is Xueli is abandoned Albany baby from China, adopted by North European, and she become the first model of albino. You know, it's pretty. I think it's very empowering. Like we include all these people and empower them, be part of the society, instead make them feel bad. I think that's the way to. There's another story about instead of giving people money, let them work for the money. Maybe give them opportunity to work. Then they really feel empowered. So we need to look into it. The system, I think, need to empower people. So not instead of just helping them. So I personally quite agree with it. I think it's very important for human value to have dignity, equity, creativity, and individuality. And I think it's need to look into it. That's why government money is so inefficient to helping people so far. Then they compare the service, the character of design, architecture, compare the education of science education, art education, and design education. And science education is learn how to determine the true nature of material world through the very objective and factual study, not exclude the sensory data. Sensory data and art education just opposite. They learn about self-expression of your emotion and feeling without very intellectual construct. So it's very subjective, personal knowledge. And design is kind of like something in between. It's a unique approach. You have to approach, you need both objective and subjective understanding on behalf of another person's interest instead of yourself. It's kind of integration of what we talked before, a reflective thought with the thinking and also practical action. That's I want to mention what Laura mentioned. So we need both practice, the design, and also reflective in order to improve as designer. It's unified of why and how. And they mentioned design communication is very important, and it's about listening, how people express and help them to live a fuller life. And I totally agree with how communication is so important for design. And I actually put Anne Pei's picture here. Every famous architect is a great communicator. I have studied. So because you have to sell, actually I'm not totally agree with what they mentioned, you know, selling is not a part of the very important in the design. Service, I think is very, very important because you basically have to sell your vision because people cannot see the design. It's not like a product. You have to sell product. People already see it. They know what they get. When you sell design, it's not exist yet. So you have to sell a vision, which is even harder sell. But you need to help them to visualize it. So I think the best architect usually a great communicator and the best salesman of their vision. That's why I'm not totally agree. Sell is not the essential nature of the design. I think they mentioned about during the design process, you don't have to sell the ideas. It's more you're working with the client to find out the idea. But based on my own experience, you still have to convince with people about the idea, because usually designer is better educated, know the design process. Client, they may not fully know. That's why I learned from my own experience. The designer really have to be very patient. Just like the kids, like tell them, you cannot do this. They say, no, I have to do it. Then they come back to you, oh yeah, I can do it. So I have found a few times I worked with a client. I said, I lay out the plan. He said, oh no, I want it this way. I said, okay, do that way. After a few days, they come back, oh, I think your way is better. I said, okay, let's go back to my way. So it's just really, you can't force your idea to others. I said, I recommend this way, but it's your house, you make final decisions. So this process, it takes time for people to learn it, but it's very important, I think, as designer, you have to design for others. No matter how you convince it's a better idea, if you cannot bring people on board, you just let them choose their own decisions. So design is a form of democracy of self-determined through interrelationship of service. And they mentioned design process actually is possible. The individual good and common good can be both considered in this framework. So service in terms of design demand heightened, refined ability to listen. This actually helped me a lot, because that's why I mentioned, this book, this chapter really helps me, because I don't think I'm a very good listener myself. I'm more extrovert, I talk more. So when I meet with the client, sometimes I just keep talking. I don't give a client enough time to talk. So it makes me reflect, like maybe because I know what they're already trying to say. And I was like, I just try to jump in. So I realized, oh, it's not a good idea. I should let them talk, be more patient, That's really, so it's mentioned, it's very important what expressed and what client haven't really expressed. I think being a good listener is very important to be a good designer. And they mentioned notitia is the concept is so you were able to pay full attention to people with true empathy and want to serve. I think this is every designer need to learn. I think we didn't learn at school, because everybody learned to be a star architect. Nobody learned to be a good service somehow. I think this need to bring to the curriculum. They call notitia is a way of being that heightened focus and attentive in extreme, and it's opposite to detachment. It's an awareness. Then we compare different relationship between designer and client. And the first one, is a designer artist. Like the designer is huge, client is like very small. So basically, the designer has complete influence over the design process. Is a star architect. People come for the name and they just love what the architect designer is doing. And then that's the aspiration for every designer to want to be. So then, I give this picture as example. The architect designer got this very futuristic building, very cool building floating on the water. It's a dream for every architect. So, and the client, because of design is so famous, they just want to be part of this. Just like Frank Lloyd Wright, Then they said, oh, the building is leaking. They said, move your chair. So I heard actually some architect also mentioned that. They said the chair is not comfortable. They said, no, it's beautiful. You have to sit in there if you want to appreciate the beauty. So it's really not client-oriented design. Then another one is just opposite, the design facilitator. So basically, I call it the drafter architect or draft designer. So they just drafter, they don't design. So I think it's all architect's nightmare. Nobody wants to be this kind of design facilitator. And the designer is very small, client is big. I think it's existing a lot of builder designer relationship developer. So they already know what they want. They just want somebody to get the permit process. So I put this building here, which I think there's not much design there. So they already know what they want. They just want somebody to facilitate the design process. There's no creative input in this whole process. Then there's a designer technician. It's I think a lot of smaller firm more like that. So designer as enabler, not contribute too much creativity but all more as an instrumental agent. So I put this building here, which is a lot of people do, like add addition here, add something there, remodel my kitchen, all this stuff. Then their designer expert, which is the designer just have this routine process to do things. Then the client just more follow the designer's process. Then there's ideal service design relationship is like a Taiji type, like the designer and the client interact with each other. Then you can create these beautiful buildings. They have full understanding the aspiration to do it, which is a very dynamic process with tension. Tension is the core. So they create this innovative, imaginative process. And it's the mutual respect. I think this is ideal. I think it's actually helped me to understand it's not just design relationship. I think it's in all relationships, even in marriage relationship. They're always like in marriage, one person dominant, that person had no say, or they're one person more dominant, and there's this equal partner, which is very hard. I have to say, the more dominant relationship is more stable than the equally dynamic relationship, but it's more ideal, I guess. Then they mentioned about the designer and client relationship. They mentioned it's not hierarchy, egalitarian relationship, but it's a more equal relationship, and it's inclusive with the center idea of service. So then they mentioned different contract type and relationship. There's a service relationship. The designer responsible more than the client because we are the professional. We should know it better. Then we have to understand how this client need, and at the same time, we have to understand we have to think about the future generation and nature environment. I actually have a little bit hard time to understand this part because this service relationship, and there's a contracting process to understand all the people involved and their roles in this whole design process and in the collaboration with client. And there's a different design protocols and need to be intentionally considered during the effectively designed. But because there's no rule, then you have to create your own to make it work. So I just wonder, when we have, I usually have contract with my client, but I just wonder, I cannot usually put in my contract, future generation need to be considered. So I think it's very hard to, it's in everybody's conscience, it's our responsibility to do it. So we have to create these things that be socially responsible. But I think the client, I can't put it in client's contract because he's not responsible for that. But it's part of my responsibility as architect, social responsible. So that part, I don't really fully get it. But then they mentioned the relationship. I think Marissa have explained pretty well about I know, and then I think it's very important. Come back to the empathy, So as designer, we have to be able to be in the client's shoes, understand. That's actually helped me to be more patient. I try to imagine me as a client, who trying to solve their problem, pay money to another designer, and they don't have they don't understand, they have no clue of the design process. So I have to hold their hand to go through it. So have the empathy and understand their needs. So you cannot rush the process. Empathy is be as the other, remaining the whole self. This is also a big lesson for me besides service, empathy. I think I really need to working on this to be a better designer. So I actually learned after reading this book, I actually have better relationship with my client already. So I can feel their pain, so I can be more patient. So they said, oh, can we have another meeting? I already created this beautiful design. Then they said, oh, it's beautiful, but I have another idea. Can we have another meeting? I said, what? I say back, I said, okay, let's have another meeting. So it's really helped me to be more patient. And then they mentioned a contract about the legal contracting. negotiating, you have to sign with the client. Then there's a value contract with the future generation and the implied contract, economic, technology, and politics. So the service contract intentionally driving the interaction and the very effective help the design team to go together. And it's very important to compositional diverse roles with this design process. So the design experience the change, motivate of their desiderata, not by others, not what others think best for them. I think this is very important with empathy. You know, I already know what's best for the client, I think, but I have to let them decide that is best for them. So I have to give them time to digest what I already think is good for them. And they finally step in, understand it fully, and maybe make changes based on their needs. I think it really requires a lot of empathy and patience and have the design in the mind. And with that, if we can fully work with the client as an important member of the team, even though they don't understand design, but they understand their life. They understand how to make their life better. I think it's very important to assume there's equity between the client and designer. It's a good lesson for designer. Instead of everybody want to be a big star architect, they think they have solution for all the humanity. We should interact with the client as equal partner. So in the summary, designer need to form intentional service contract with constituent. Client is clear on expectation. They have aligned, integrated, go into the design process with this complex interaction, design contract, engage intentionally in the process of designing. They create this, as empathy lead the way, they create these things that are appropriate for the situation and identify their goal with open communication. I think this is a whole process the designer really need to be conscious of. And in the end, I want to share, you know, how this whole study helped me with my design. This is a project I'm working on right now, and I shared in the Instagram. And Joe recommended me to share with everybody here. And I said, each word revision seems to really help the whole to go together better. That's when you know you're in the right design direction. The book Design Way helped me to understand the design process better, from unconscious to conscious. I guess that's how we improve in every field. Every profession help us to understand life better. It's a media, it's a channel. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeng. Appreciate that. All right, folks, so now we're going to go into the breakout rooms. And in the breakout rooms, again, you know, they're going to be led by Becky, Evanique, and Maritza this time. And you're welcome to discuss any aspects of this chapter. Again, Jeng, you're doing a fantastic job. I love the slides. It's a great way of summarizing everything that, you know, that the chapter covers. You do such a spectacular job. And it jogs everybody's memories about the chapter. So there is a lot more, you know, questions that come up, a lot more discussion. So we'll go directly into the breakout rooms. After you come back with the best questions you have. And one of the questions I'm going to ask everybody is going to be about the terms. We're going to be talking about the terms client, service, contract. If you think that, you know, whether those terms are the best terms to use, do you have any suggestions? So just any open-ended discussion of the terms that are used here. All right, so with that, I'm going to start the breakout rooms now. Folks are back. Welcome, folks. Welcome back. Welcome back. All right, it's time for Q&A and questions and comments, but we're going to start with questions. We'll collect all the questions. And then we are going to start with the question of terminology, and then we'll go from there. All right. So go ahead and type !! if you would like to put a question on the table. Only your best questions, please. All right, anybody with questions? I don't see any questions. All right, we'll start with Maritza, followed by Charlie. Maritza.
What comes to mind for me is, what is the role of initiation in this concept of service relationship?
Wonderful. Initiation in service relationship. Excellent question. Next up is Charlie. Charlie, what's your question?
Is it reasonably possible to reframe the concept of design within a process philosophy conception?
Okay. Design within process philosophy. Next up is going to be Joe.
It's a bit of a generic question, but how would you define what a good listener is? You know, in a sense, like is part of the communication process.
What is a good listener? Very good.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. Any more questions? All right, then we're going to go, let's go with the question on terminology. Client. What do you think of the term client? Everything that has been said about service relationship, considering all of that, is there a word better than client? What do you see as the issues with the concept of client? What would you use? So go ahead, type exclamation mark if you would like to talk about the concept of client. Next up is going to be Evanik, Tom, and Jing. Evanik, what do you think?
I like the word client. I think it's a good, because the client is the person that is receiving a service from the designer.
Mm-hmm.
And if the designer is in service of the client, they're trying to achieve the client's idea or desiderata. And, you know, in order to do that, the client, like, you're supposed to listen to the client and you know, achieve what the client wants, and not just say yes to the client. It's like, okay, this is what you want. This is how you're going to get there. And if the client has ideas, you listen to them and you let them know in an honest, truthful way, whether it works or it doesn't work. So I like the idea, especially when it's applicable to the book.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Tom, Jing, and Lori. Tom, what do you think?
Well, I don't like the word client alone. I like the word stakeholder, and by stakeholder, the broad spectrum of everybody and everything that influences your design. Client says I'm paying. A client is maybe 1/50th of the stakeholders, a very small fraction of them. Okay, they're influential because they're paying money, but something like
Tom, let me do one thing. So Tom has written extensively about stakeholders. So can you take about 2-3 minutes? Go ahead and talk about the concept of stakeholder.
Okay, stakeholder is defined in systems engineering and in engineering associations as any people, individuals or groups that have requirements for the system of any kind. I've extended that to be anything such as a law, a policy, or a contract. In other words, and even we're even looking at stakeholders like opponents or enemies, and weak and impoverished and things like that. So I've tried to extend the stakeholder concept to anything that's important to know about and consider in your project. That's my definition of it. And so people aren't, and client is extremely narrow here. Mm-hmm. You know, to size it up, it's 1/50th, and the other 49/50ths are the other stakeholders you have to consider to even give your primary client good service. Because if you forget, like, city regulations, and the price goes up for the whole project by $1 million because you did, you're not servicing your primary client. Okay.
Wonderful.
Oh.
Beautifully put. And thank you for staying up till 5 a.m. in Scandinavia
Yeah,
to
we're getting
participate.
there.
Always wonderful to have you here. Thank you. Next up is Jing, followed by Laurie and Joe. Jing.
Yeah, personally, I don't have problem with client. That's what we call the people we work with. And I think the rules, the city rule, that's part of the profession we're training. We have to serve our client to follow those rules. That's why we have professional training to be able to help them, to achieve the goal. And, the client for the smaller projects, personal, for bigger project, they're bigger, like their board meeting, I have designed public work. We have board. The board is a surrogate client, but then the real client is the public. So there's different situations. I think I don't have problem with client or service. I think design is a professional service. That's very clear. There's nothing bad about service. Sometimes we think about service, we relate it with servant somehow. So I don't know why, but service is a equal, noble relationship. It's user knowledge, helping others achieve their goal. And I have no problem with that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jing. Next up is Laurie, followed by Joe. Laurie.
Okay, so I also don't have a problem with the word client if we're talking about, your typical design project, like I would do as an engineer or Jeng as an architect. But if you wanted to broaden your definition of design, as is suggested, say in the beginning of the book, where we were saying we're all designing animals, then say if you wanted to say design my family, then who's the client? Then you could say our family is, but that it sort of loses it there a little bit for me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with Tom in that the word client is actually very narrow. So and it depends on by industry, that if you're going to define who the client is. So if I'm a doctor, who's your client? It's a patient. It's so these things actually have a way of kind of changing in each industry as to, you can call it a client, but I think that there are different words for each industry. And that's why I think something a little bit more broad actually captures like a stakeholder, somebody that is actually reliant on you, is a little bit more, captures more of what you're trying to communicate. That's just my personal opinion.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Becky.
I see Tom's point on why it might be beneficial to think stakeholder in terms of consequences, and but also like for me, it's like client is like the key stakeholders, and ultimately who sponsors the project. But by thinking of, because sometimes the client's not the customer or the consumer, and when you think of stakeholders, well, then you're incorporating the consequences. How is it going to affect your consumers and your customers who are the actual end users? And so I do see the benefit of that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Let's look at the second term here, that of service. What do you think of the term service itself? Maritza, you can go ahead and respond to either client or service. Go ahead.
That works. I have an unfleshed out thought for using somehow members for clients. It seems slightly more inclusionary, but then I don't know, I do like Tom's idea of using stakeholders, but stakeholders still brings to mind the idea of design as a business idea. And if we want to take a step back and look at it as we are design animals idea, how, like Laurie said, how do I call a design process that is for my community? And so I was thinking members, and if we're saying service to members, I think that works. And I would keep the word service because it implies the concept of looking to others. And I feel that that's vital in this process. And that's what this chapter is trying to remind us, that when we say design process, the behind the scenes assumption should always be that there exists service to those who will be affected by the design process. And so I kind of like the word members.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Marisa. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Charlie. Kevin.
Hi, Frank. For me, it's the word of meaning matters. Like if you see from time to time, then it's a democrat from the like different industry. Maybe we consider client service would be different. Then as general project perspective, in who is the investor, where's the money come from, or sponsor. Then if you generally use client, who is end user? The client maybe, let's see, if a corporation, a client, end user so inconvenient maybe, but it's suffered by users, but not client. So, and in the middle between the phase, let's say you got money, you need design or engineering. So the who is, it's a mutual, I feel like a mutual relationship, a very dynamic, changeable, balanced. Let's see, sometimes you act like a client, sometimes you act like from the service provider. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Charlie, what do you think about the concept of service?
Not surprisingly, I think it's very important to see the context that when you're thinking about service to whom or to what? And if you're looking at it from a process philosophy point of view, what you see is like whole laundry. You see gestalt within gestalts within gestalts, and like in the human body, you have individual cells that have a contractual responsibility for its functioning within the cell, and so on. And they make up organs, and the organs make up bodies, and so on and so forth. And so that the concept of service, as I see it, is taking responsibility to make sure that you are part of the whole, okay, rather than becoming a cancer cell where I'm going to go off and do my own thing, you know, and basically destroy the organism. Okay, so that's kind of like the cradle to grave architecture. It's paying respect to the fact that we are living on a spaceship Earth, to quote Buckminster Fuller, and that we need to develop a sense of responsibility, which is again ability to respond with a fealty to values, and those values are, to me, are like truth, beauty, and goodness, and with respect within the context of a process philosophy. And so, for me, genuine service has to be respectful of the larger process.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is Joe.
So I like service a lot. So that would be my first word. But if I'm trying to think outside of the box, I'm trying to think of another word. The word utility kind of comes to mind, and usefulness as well. As far as Charlie was just talking about the different parts and their roles in our body. Well, there has to be a use for it. So there has to be almost that's not purpose. I understand that that's not purpose, but I think utility actually does capture another dynamic to service. It's not necessarily I like service better because I think that it actually aligns with my values better, but utility also is a part of that. Maybe that's part of.
Thank you. Next up, thanks, Joe. Next up is Tom. Tom, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to try something different. Of course, we need to serve our clients, but the role of the designer, when we take the stakeholder perspective and we try to find the values of the stakeholders, is to deliver a design that reasonably serves all the different stakeholder interests and values. So it's a matter of compromises, as in politics, but it's not a matter of maximizing value to the client, because then you're violating the needs of other stakeholders and you're going to get in trouble. So service, but I've tried to coin a term, balanced value delivery to stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to talk about the application that I run into all the time with my meetups. I have people who are listeners, who are audience, and many times I have speakers. And I have to do right by the audience and I have to do right by the speakers. And what I've found is that my being focused on the audience and make sure that value is being delivered to the audience is the best way I can be offering the best value to the speakers. And because what is really crucial is the trade going on between speakers and the audience. And if I know that the audience is fully engaged, the audience is understanding what the speakers are saying, even if I have to interrupt the speakers, I have to do anything, overall value delivered to both the audience and the speaker goes up. So it's very interesting. Like whenever, I find that, both with in my company where I do events, that is also true. Like the speakers may be hiring me to do something, but it's only when the audience is very happy with the speakers that they are going to get the value. So I many times have to go against the speakers at many points, keep telling them, no, don't do this, even if they don't like it. But at the end of it, they will thank me. It said, I didn't realize that I was doing that. Or I didn't realize that this was the consequence of what I was doing. So I think by being kind of focused on the audience, so that's the form in which I face this. So I want to go to two other questions, really fundamental questions about listening and initiating. So firstly, on listening, what is a good listener? What is a good listener? How do you evaluate yourself? When you say you're trying to listen, what are you doing? What are your thoughts about listening? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to speak about listening. Evanik.
When you're listening, you're trying to hear what the other person, not only what the other person is saying, but also where they're coming from, where they got their ideas, what is trying, if you're talking about design, what is trying to be achieved, what's the goal, what's the desiderata. And I think you're doing it without listening to respond. You're just listening just to get to know what is going on. So you're taking, in a sense, you're taking yourself out of it and you're trying to understand what the other person is really, where the other person is really coming from and their ideas, and asking questions, not to respond, but just to really, if you're not understanding something, to really understand and relate to that person that you're talking to.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanik. Next up is Mike, Jing, Becky, Joe, and Ambika. Mike.
I think it's a skill that can be worked on. I just experienced it speaking now after Evanik. So when Evanik was talking, I know in the back of my mind that I'm talking next. So I have this internal battle that's going on. I'm trying to formulate my words that are about to come out, but at the same time, I want to listen to Evanik and process what she's saying. It's a very hard thing to do. So I think practice, this is the perfect format to work on that. I don't know if anybody else ever experiences that, but when I know I'm next to speak, then all of a sudden the words of the person before me, they begin to get a little, they go into the gray area.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Jing, followed by Becky. Jing.
Yeah, I think good listening is you not just listen to what they say, you try to understand their mindset. So why they say something, what they were thinking, how do they feel? And I think let's take experience and also psychology maybe to be able to understand fully.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Becky, Joe, Ambika, Tom, and Robert. Becky.
I would say how well you listen would be best measured by how well the person felt heard and understood. And so that it's like the resonate, the empathy, the speaker's ability to feel that that connection is formed. And I agree with you, Mike. It is definitely a skill that you can pick up with practice, because I read a lot of books this year on listening, and I was terrible at it. You don't realize how terrible at it you are until you realize you're always trying to jump the gun and solve someone's problem without fully understanding what the problem is. And so, and I'm a math person, so I'm always trying to solve problems. But with when you start noticing your own patterns and your own projection of what you think the person is saying, just stopping and instead asking more, you become so surprised how wrong you are. And that gives you enough humility to be like, I don't know what's in the other person's mind. So
Wonderful. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Joe, followed by Ambika. Joe.
I think, listening, there's a lot of different dimensions to it. And I think a good listener is obviously is listening to the words that somebody is using. And so they can kind of start to just put together a story to see what their background is, their mentality is. And then also it's very important to be able to read body language. And I think that that's a form of listening as well. That you're actually starting to see what somebody's reaction is to something. That's the feedback that you need, that is nonverbal, that you have to somehow incorporate, whether that, if somebody looks at something for the first time and they're really wowed by it, that's going to show up in their face. Mm-hmm. And so if you design something, that you can be like, wow, I would have never thought of this. This is better than anything I ever thought of. Then that's feedback, and that's listening. Or if you get somebody that's petrified or whatever the hell you put together, then that's also feedback as well. So I think that it's not just watching what they say, it's watching how they say it, it's watching what words they use, and it's watching their reactions. It's a multifaceted process.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Ambika, followed by Tom, Robert, and Jeff. Ambika.
I really loved what Becky and Joe said, so it covers everything. And I just wanted to add a small point, what is known as reflective listening. Sometimes you speak back to them what they have said exactly the way they said it to confirm that you have it. And it puts them in a place where, oh yeah, she got it or he got it. And so it becomes reciprocal at that point. And I think that's when you also create a certain connection with which you can move forward with whatever you are creating together. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambika. That's a great point. I think that's a surefire way, because I've realized that most of the times I'm not really succeeding in listening, even though I think I'm listening. So the simplest way is to tell people, okay, this is what I hear. Is that correct? And then they will correct you. So a handshake actually works really well. Next up is Tom and Robert. Tom.
Okay, many good points. And as Joe said, it's a very rich thing. I'm going to take a very narrow one. I have to very often listen to written words rather than the voice and the person in person. And what I've discovered is that people rarely, they often write something they don't really mean, but it's the best way they know how to articulate it. So listening means, if I can get behind and say, do you really mean that? Would you really prioritize that? That's feedback from me, but I'm listening deeply, trying to find out what they really mean. Okay? The ultimate interpretation of what they really mean, that's actually a design that pleases them.
Wonderful, wonderful. I really like the direction in which you have taken this of saying written work, because we are listening to, for example, we are reading Lao Tzu. What is he saying to us? And you kind of have to get his context, his entire life story, the context in which he operated in order to understand what he's doing. Wonderful. Next up is Robert, Jeff, and Laura. Robert.
I would like to say what I think a person who listens well is, as opposed to a good listener, because there are good listeners and there are bad people that are listeners. So I want to make that distinction. But I think a person who listens well has earnest interest in what the speaker or the person is saying, and has resonance with them at some level of the conversation that's going on.
Oh, that's wonderful point, Robert. I think a lot of the things that I keep coming back to is really the level at which you are seeing the other person, whether you're seeing the core of the person or you're seeing just the words, because it's a question of, are you actually seeing the person? Are you actually focused on who the person is in their entire context, in the context of their entire life? So the words that you're seeing, instead of just reacting to what is coming at you, you're trying to actually be, I think relationship is a very good point, the I thou kind of a relationship. So thank you. That's a great point. Next up is Jeff.
So this is a wonderful conversation about such an important topic, and I'm personally involved with people a great deal who really strongly disagree with each other on things that are very important to them, and so what I've learned and try to support them in doing, and occasionally have to enforce in situations, is this active listening, is being earnestly curious, is the reflective listening back, and it sounds a little bit like this. And I'm just gonna say the questions to you because they're so important. This is a way easier thing to talk about than to do. So it sounds like this. Somebody says something. It may seem just completely off the wall to the other person or the people in the room. And the question sounds like, that's really interesting. Can you tell me more about that? Giving them the chance to reconsider it, and as well as explain it more than they did at first. And you often find out a little bit about why they believe it, which is really important because it's probably the thing you're missing. You're hearing their immediate opinion, but you don't really know why they have it. And the next question is, what else can you tell me about that? So it gives them the opportunity once more. And maybe they'll tell you some experience they had from which they drew a conclusion. Whether you think it was a good conclusion or not, at least you get to hear their experience and the conclusion they drew from it, even if you would draw a completely different conclusion, which I'm telling you is often the case. So then, as Shrikant was saying, the ability to say, okay, what I hear you saying is, and kind of as Ambika said, say it back to them so that it really is, there's enough of their words in it so they get that you were listening to their words, because it seems funny to give someone's words right back to them. But you'll notice that if you don't, they'll say, no, what I said was this. And because your summary or paraphrase is sometimes very difficult to do. And then if they want to correct you, let them correct you and then reflect again. And then the next step is one of validation, which is really, wow, if that happened to me, I might feel the exact same thing. I really get how you could come to that conclusion. And when somebody feels like you've taken the time to let them express themselves, and you've checked out whether or not you're understanding what they're really saying, probably, and why, and then you validate it, you earn, in often a relational way, an opportunity to be able to share something with them. And the amazing thing is, and this is the conclusion, is while this sounds like a compassionate and kind of serving way of helping people express themselves and increasing understanding, let me give you a secret. If you hope to persuade somebody of anything about which they have a strong opinion, where you strongly disagree, and it feels important to you, do this first. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Really, really good stuff. Thank you. Next up is Laura, Becky, and Ambika. Laura, what do you think about listening?
Well, I've been listening here, and I think all these guys have said much more than I can say at this point in the evening. So I'm going to let my time go to the next person.
Sounds good. Thank you. Next up is Becky.
I really like the point about everything being in context, because if I say I don't have anything to wear, it means I haven't done my laundry, there's nothing available. If my sister says that, it means there are 20 outfits lined up in the closet and she doesn't feel like wearing any of those that day. So having that active listening, it's not just listening to the content, it's understanding what's behind it. And as so many of you guys have mentioned, it's making the person feel known. You have to know what's the viewpoint, the perspective of the person, the upbringing, the background beliefs, what's causing it. It's like the ground and the figure. It's everything that really shapes the content. And sometimes the content doesn't mean anything without really understanding the person as a whole. And with listening, it's surprisingly a dialogue. And the listener walks away knowing so much more about the person. But the best part is the listener walks away knowing more about himself, because through that process, you've clarified the initial conversation just through trying to clarify it yourself. So the person and you both walk away knowing more about each other and having that connection.
Wonderful, wonderful. I like the word, I think context captures it. So it's not just the content, but the entire context that is behind that. Next up is Ambika, and then we will go to the next topic. Ambika.
So I just wanted to add a small point where I think Joe mentioned something about the physicality of the person to whom you are listening. And I wanted to add that the listener too must be physically present and make it apparent. I mean, if you cross your leg over the other leg and it cuts out that flow, then that's not okay. You know, if the person is to your right, sort of, and your right leg is crossed over, that's a cut. So you need to be sitting physically open with clear boundaries at the same time. And all of this for me comes back to more and more, everything is about devotion. Because in devotion is also duty. and therefore that connection and relationship is maintained, and a certain way of keeping eye contact without, in being invasive. So just being relaxed and present.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambika. All right. The next question, and this is going to be the last question. Let's say you're listening very well. When you're designing, you have to also initiate. So what do you think of initiation in the process of service? Any thoughts on initiation? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. If you want, you can talk about the relationship between listening and initiation. Tom.
I have a simple way of initiating conversations with my clients, and it gets the conversation started, and it shows I'm willing to listen. And I simply say, what is the most important, critical thing for you right now? Name it. That's a good starting point.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anybody else? Go ahead, Mike. Mike, you're next.
Yeah, I think initiating a conversation was perfectly executed tonight when Becky told her story, because it was infused with genuine emotion. And I think if you initiate anything and the listener perceives genuine emotion, you have now glued that listener to the rest of the conversation. I know Becky did that for me earlier. So I think that's a very important component, infusing emotion into your first steps.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Ambika, Maritza, and Laurie. Ambika.
I would say something like, what is the first thing you would like to work on? What is the first thing you would like me to attend to? Or how do you feel about this? I think when we say feel rather than think, it gets them to connect with their heart. Not that we want everybody to get gooey, because then you don't move forward. I mean, there's a very clear distinction between coming from heart presence and getting into emotive Hallmark card, sentiment, because you want to keep that space clear. So you initiate by calling attention to what would interest them, what would be interesting to them that you might bring forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambika. Next up is Maritza, Laurie, and Joe. Maritza.
So when I think of initiation, I think of, again, my favorite word in the last couple of months is intentionality, and the idea that we should acknowledge from whence the initiation begins in a design process. If we don't, and we lose sight of where it began, we cannot leverage off of those things that stack on top of it. So I think that initiation is, what do we have already? What is being brought to this round table from all members that will be affected as we begin this design process? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Laurie, followed by Joe. Laurie.
So last Friday night, I had to go to this sort of business dinner dance thing, and I'm very introverted, and I don't enjoy that, but so I've developed some techniques, and so I just, because I need to mingle, I'm supposed to mingle and make contact. So I just go up to people and I just go, well, how are you doing tonight? And that's all it takes. And then I can, start to get into a conversation and listen, but it's very intentional for me, because it doesn't come naturally, but I'm getting better as I get older, and that's what I do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laurie. Next up is Joe.
I think the best way to initiate something is essentially by asking what you could do for them. I mean, essentially that is the way and it's taking that service approach. It's that simple, because I think anytime that you go in and even ask them like directly. It starts it off as kind of almost like this kind of let them tell you, and then you can kind of go and build it from there. That would be my approach.
Let's see. Thank you. All right, folks. So I want to tell you about a meetup that I was not planning to do, but I'm going to do, and that's going to be on Friday. I was not going to do a meetup on Bhagavad Gita on Friday, but I found something quite stunning. I'm going to tell you a story on Friday because I'm able to summarize all of Bhagavad Gita and pretty much all of Indian philosophy using that story. Thanks to this gentleman called Sri Aurobindo. Now, he has written a 900-page book on it, okay? But the story is actually very simple. There is a TEDx, TED Ed video of 3 minutes with cartoons with 3 million views of this story. This is one of the most famous stories in the Indian mythology. This is part of Mahabharata. We are studying Bhagavad Gita. You know, this is one of the 3 things we are studying: Tao Te Ching, Gospel of John, and Bhagavad Gita. I think we're doing a fantastic job with Tao Te Ching. We have already done a fantastic job with Tao Te Ching. Gospel of John is amazing. Bhagavad Gita is much harder because I think Indian mind is much more focused on the inside, and to make that accessible to the Western mind is very hard. So the question is, how do we do it? And I have found a shortcut. So I'm going to tell a story on Friday. I'm going to put up a video, which is going to be about an 18-minute video that summarizes the story. I would invite you to watch it. Then I'm going to give you a 3-minute video, which is going to be a cheat video. If you don't get to watch the 18-minute video, you can watch that. And then I'm going to actually tell the story. For Thanksgiving, I'm visiting my friends Rupali and Rohit. So I'm going to try to get them involved in telling the story as well. It's a famous story. And the beauty of it is that in that story, the way in which Aurobindo deals with it, which is actually consistent with the core of the story, but he just extracts principles out of it. It talks about pretty much the key ideas and key approaches or key paths that Indian philosophy has. So for example, in Gita, we are going to be talking about 4 yogas. Karma yoga, which has to do with the path of work. Bhakti yoga, which is the path of devotion. Jnana yoga, which is the path of knowledge. And Raja yoga, which is the path of concentration of mind. This story brings together these 4 yogas in terms of 4 characters, actually a family. A father and a son, and a father and a daughter, and the son and daughter getting married. And they are going through life and death struggles. And it's going to tell the virtues of each of these ways of operating, each of these paths, and how they intersect with each other through characters. So I'm going to just tell you the story first, okay? To get you started. It will give you a fantastic foundation for understanding the Indian mind. And then about a month from then, I'm going to have Nilesh Marik come back. He's an expert on Sri Aurobindo. So he has really internalized this 900-page book. And he's going to tell the story at a much deeper philosophical level. Okay, so that is the best way that I can think of bringing Bhagavad Gita to a Western audience. So I'm going to tell you a story on Friday. So I've not announced the meetup yet, but I'll be doing that soon. If you can make it, please do. I'll Otherwise, happy Thanksgiving. The videos will go up immediately, so you can go watch the video if you're busy with your family. All right. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Thanksgiving is one of my favorite holidays. So please, have a great time, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Happy
Bye.
Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Bye.
Bye.